Okay, so our next lesson, part 2, okay, is going to be over the cattle boom and bust. And hopefully after this lesson as well as the first one, we should be able to trace the beginnings of the cattle industry in Texas from longhorn cattle, which was lesson 1, to famous cattle drive trails and the boom and bust cycles resulting from the rise and fall of the demand for beef. So that's those last few ones are going to be what we learn in this one right here. All right. So our big ideas are to, at the end of this, we will be able to describe at least 2 things that contributed to the cattle boom in Texas. Now, if you guys don't know, a boom is something, is whenever something explodes. So like, as it just like all of a sudden is super duper needed, or there's a super high demand for it. A bust, okay, is the opposite of that, where the demand for it just like nearly disappears in a matter of days. So that's whenever we talk about booms and busts, that's what those 2 different things are, okay? The next big idea is, how did the invention of barbed wire contribute to the fence cutting wars in Texas? And then lastly, how did the cattle bust affect Texans? And how did ranchers try to adapt to the change? The vocabulary word that this lesson gives us is breeds, which I will give you, and then I'm going to add a couple more in there for y'all. Okay, so the 3 vocabulary words that I just want us to make sure that we know the definitions and differences of are breeds. They all start with B. They're breeds. All right, so we probably all know that, but just in case, a breed is an animal of the same species with different characteristics, okay? And then boom and bust, they pretty much always exclusively go together. Not always, but most of the time. So a boom is a sudden economic success. Okay, so whenever something is all of a sudden really, really in high demand. And then the bust is just the very opposite, where there is a sudden economic depression or depletion or lack of demand. So nobody needs it anymore. Okay, so during the 1800s, demand for beef and the ability to successfully drive cattle north from Texas created the beginning of the cattle boom. Many things contributed to the cattle boom. Railroad tracks were being laid, making it easier and faster to transport cattle to new markets. Refrigerated railroad cars were developed so cattle could be slaughtered before being transported. Removing Native Americans from the Texas plains to reservations in Indian Territory, now known as Oklahoma, meant that more land was available for bigger ranches with more cattle. Everyone was making money. Cattle ranchers could purchase 600 cows for $5,400 and sell them in Kansas for $16,800. Millions of cattle were driven from Texas to Kansas and Wyoming and then shipped east, where the population and economy were expanding. So right here, this little illustration just kind of shows how they were starting here in Texas, okay, and being transported here. I hope you remember what this trail right here is called, from San Angelo to Cheyenne, as well as this one from San Antonio to Abilene, all right? But then there grew more smaller ones that weren't near as popular as those 2, from way down here in southern Texas all the way to Missouri, and then all the way up into Nebraska. So this was a really big money maker for Texas. And also on this illustration, you couldn't see them on the last one, so I went over them with pencil. These railroads are being built all across the United States. And so that was how the United States would transport things cross country. So if somebody, over here in California needed something from New York City, well, it would have to take several days, but it would get there via trains, because there weren't airplanes, there weren't big semi trucks that could, get it there in a couple days. It would take probably a week or so. So the cattle boom and the railroads are kind of coming in at the same time, and it's really, really doing some really great things for Texas currently at this time period. So right here, where it shows on our key that, these are the railroads, and I kind of colored over them a little bit with my pencil. This is how they would transport not only cattle, but any other needs that were, that came about. But for ranchers and cattlemen in Texas, they were really, really helpful in getting, their heads, they'd drive them up here to the big spot, and then those people who bought them there could put them on trains to different ends of the country. King Ranch. During the cattle boom, cattle ranches were built on open ranges. This is a vocabulary word. Do we remember what that means? That stretched from Texas to Canada. This area became known as Cattle Kingdom. King Ranch in South Texas was part of Cattle Kingdom. Richard King and Gideon Lewis purchased 15,500 acres from the Mexican government and turned it into one of the most important cattle ranches in the state. In the early days of King Ranch, a drought struck South Texas and northern Mexico. Since King Ranch had the area's only source of fresh water, nearby townspeople begged the man they called Captain King to buy their cattle so they wouldn't die. Instead of buying their cattle, King offered to provide ranchers with food, shelter, and income if they would move to South Texas and work on his ranch. They agreed, and King suddenly found himself with the most experienced ranch hands and cowboys in the state. By the end of the Civil War, King Ranch had grown to 146,000 acres with thousands of cattle. Captain King's brand on his cattle was the famous Running W, which I'll show you a picture of. After his death in 1885, King's wife, Henrietta, continued Captain King's vision for his ranch. By 1925, King Ranch stretched across more than 1 million acres of South Texas. Henrietta King used her wealth to give land for the towns of Kingsville and Raymondsville. She donated money to build churches and schools. King also helped establish Texas A&M University in Kingsville. Now, if you'll notice right here, here's Austin, which is where, as we know, Texas was kind of started. That's where the first settlements were. That's where several of the first missions were. So down here in South Texas, there is so much history for our state. Other ranches in South Texas. Other large ranches developed in South Texas where the warm, dry climate was perfect for raising cattle. In 1877, Manuel Guerra settled in Roma, Texas, established a successful cattle ranch, and became a leader in his community. South Texas rancher Margaret Borland owned more than 10,000 cattle. In 1873, she even headed up her own trail drive to Kansas. She took 3 of her children, all under the age of 15, and her granddaughter on the dusty trail. In 1834, Thomas O'Connor immigrated to South Texas from Ireland. At 17, he was the youngest Texan to fight in the Battle of San Jacinto. For his service, he was granted land by the Republic of Texas. By the time he was 28, Thomas had registered the TC brand and began raising cattle. In 1873, Thomas sold his herd of cattle for $140,000 and bought land, which was very cheap at that time. He was the first rancher in Refugio County to fence in his land with barbed wire. By the time of his death in 1887, Thomas O'Connor owned more than 500,000 fenced acres across 6 Texas counties with 100,000 cattle, valued at $4.5 million. All right, ranches in the Texas Panhandle. Now, this is where I'm from, as you guys all know, so I know a little bit about this stuff. In the 1870s, Charles Goodnight and John Adair established one of the first ranches in the Texas Panhandle. They found that the region's flat, open land with plenty of grass was a good place to raise cattle. J.A., which is John Adair, Ranch became large and successful, and it still is today. By the 1880s, more than 40,000 cattle grazed on 700,000 acres of grass in Paladero Canyon. In 1883, John Scarborough left New York and headed to Texas. John was the son of German immigrants who had experience working on his father-in-law's ranch in New York. When he arrived in Texas, Scarborough bought a few acres of land and a herd of sheep in Fort Worth. 4 years later, he moved to the Texas Panhandle and founded the family cattle ranch. After his death, John's nephew Clarence grew Scarborough Ranch to more than 150,000 acres across 4 counties. Joseph Glidden. Joseph Farwell Glidden was born in Clarendon, New York. He became a school teacher, but after marrying Clarissa Foster in 1837, he purchased a small farm on the open range of West Texas. Without a fence, Glidden had a very difficult time protecting his crops from being trampled by the family dog and keeping his livestock from escaping. Building a fence out of wood was expensive because there weren't many trees growing in the West Texas plains. And hopefully we all remember that that's, around this area. Okay, Great Plains, West Texas Plains falls in there. In 1874, Glidden invented barbed wire. Using a coffee bean grinder, he twisted pieces of wire together and connected them at different places along another smooth wire. Barbs stuck up and kept people and animals from entering or leaving his property. So this is pretty interesting, okay? And something we might need to identify as important is that Glidden, okay, Joseph Farwell Glidden, invented barbed wire. Barbed wire fences. Joseph Glidden's simple invention made it possible for farmers and ranchers in the open range to protect their crops and fence in their cattle. It also made Glidden one of the wealthiest men in the nation. In 1877, Joseph Glidden was declared father of barbed wire. By the end of the 1880s, there were barbed wire fences surrounding ranches in almost every Texas county. This marked the end of the open range in Texas. Before his death in 1906, Glidden owned a 250,000 acre ranch in Texas, a hotel, a bank, and a newspaper. Building barbed wire fences all over Texas and ending the open range had unexpected consequences. Without the use of open range, owners of small cattle ranches complained that they had no way to feed their herds. There were so many barbed wire fences that public roads were blocked and mail delivery was interrupted. Many large ranchers fenced off water sources even though they didn't own land on which the water was located. Now, I do want you guys to know that, just note, okay, that Joseph Farwell Glidden, okay, there's a little town that's right here on the edge of Texas, okay, pretty much basically almost in Mexico, and it is named Farwell after this guy. Fence cutting wars. In 1883, Texas was hit by a drought. Without access to water and grass, cattle began to die. Before long, fence cutting wars broke out. As soon as the sun went down, groups of cowboys calling themselves the Owls, the Javelinas, or Blue Devils cut barbed wire fences of large ranches that had water. When the sun came up, ranchers found miles and miles of barbed wire fences with holes in them. Wealthy cattle owners hired guards to protect their barbed wire fences. Gunfights between landowners and fence cutters were frequent. Texas Rangers were called in for protection. By fall of 1883, more than $20 million in damage had been caused by fence cutting across the state. In 1884, Governor John Ireland called an emergency session of the legislature. A law was passed that made fence cutting illegal. Those found guilty would be sent to prison. The law also required a gate in every 3 miles of barbed wire fence. In addition, ranchers were banned from putting up fences on land they did not own. The cattle bust. Now, do we all remember what this word means? If not, I'll go ahead and tell you. It's the sudden economic depression, or whenever something that was in super high demand and was needed all the way everywhere, it's the opposite of that. So whenever suddenly everything isn't needed and nobody wants it anymore. Beginning in 1885, demand for cattle in the eastern part of the United States began to drop. This was the beginning of the cattle bust. Cattle ranchers in Texas were no longer able to make huge profits driving their cattle north to Kansas and Wyoming. Everyone suffered, from wealthy ranchers in Cattle Kingdom to those who made their living on cattle drives, including drovers, cowboys, cookies, which is just the cook, and wranglers. In the early 1700s, sheep ranching had been introduced in Texas by the Spanish. In the late 1800s, sheep ranching began to expand. Demand for wool in the United States was great, especially in New England states. New England is just another word for the northern states, where huge clothing factories turned wool into blankets, coats, and clothes. This led to a rise in wool prices. Cattle ranchers were angry because sheep ate grass all the way to the root, making it